what I have here is my, let me think, this is my left, so the person who's wearing it, it's their left back skirt, and this is the left back skirt yoke. This is my center back, this is my side seam, and it's face up right now. What I want to do is take my yoke and put it face to face so that this bigger curve is against my skirt and the smaller curve, which is my waist, is aiming down towards the hem. My 1-inch seam allowances are on the same side and my 1/2-inch seam allowances are on the same side. And notice how when I line the facing piece or the yoke piece up to the skirt, the shapes deviate from each other. That's okay. They're fabric, so that they create the shape on our dress form. So I'm going to take my yoke piece that's in fabric and I'm going to put it face to face with my skirt. I'm going to line up my 1/2-inch seam allowance, which I did a bad job of marking. So this is the vertical seam allowance. And then here, my 1-inch seam allowance down the center back, I will line that up. These are opposing curves. So they are trying to go in different directions. So it'll take a little finessing to get them to fit together. I put some unnecessary notches, which are notches for the darts. We wouldn't normally have those in production, but I thought it would be helpful for me, being that I'm not a production sewer, to sew my yoke together if I had a few extra notches. So your pieces are not on grain, they're on the bias. So they might be acting differently. You can stay stitch them to try and keep them from stretching out. You can base them. I'm going to try just easing with pins and easing while I sew to make sure these pieces line up to each other. But I can see that on the curvier part of my yoke especially, it's acting a little wavy. So I'll just put a few extra pins in there to help me manage my ease so that I don't end up with a big bubble at the end, but I get to distribute the shape of the yoke to the shape of the skirt. So that's a lot of pins for me, but it's going to help me ease my yoke in properly. Okay, so now that I have my back yoke pinned to my back skirt, I am going to go ahead and sew it. So on my pattern that I made, I put 1/2-inch seam allowance for these pieces along this seam. Because I made a pattern with 1/2-inch seam allowance, I am going to sew with 1/2-inch seam allowance. So right at my 1/2-inch seam allowance, the yoke and the skirt are aligned right at the 1/2-inch seam allowance. Beyond the 1/2-inch seam allowance, as long as your two pattern pieces line up right at the 1/2-inch seam allowance. So only at the intersection of the 1/2-inch seam allowance and your piece must they align. Beyond that, they should go in different directions because they're going to be fitting different parts of the body. So I'm going to use my regular 2.5, 3 stitch and 1/2-inch seam allowance, and I'll back stitch where I start and stop. I'm going to go grab my pin dish so that I can pull my pins out as I go. And then I'm using my fingers to like press down on the, like press the yoke fabric towards the skirt fabric. And I have the yoke facing me because that's the thing that needed to be eased. And I'm sort of smashing the yoke gently, but I'm smashing the yoke fabric down to the skirt to help it ease in. So I'm not holding it down to the machine. I'm just trying to ease the yoke that is a little less stable into the skirt. I want to make sure that I can't see them, but I want to make sure that my dart excess is pointing towards the center the way I pressed it, so I can feel them. And I also put pins in my darts to make sure that they stay in the correct direction when I sew. And then when I get to the end, I backstitch. So I'm going to do this same procedure with the other back skirt and back yoke. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this over to my iron and I'm going to press my seam allowances up towards the yoke. So let's go do that real quick. How did that tape get there? What little gremlins are running around in my studio? So you can see how the seam is like ruffling. That's because this outer edge of the seam allowance curve is larger than this seam. And so when I try to press my seam allowance up, the curve needs to buckle in on itself. Now, because I have a loose weave crepe, this crepe fabric is kind of a loose weave, and it's wool, I can probably use the iron to press that into submission. But ultimately, I'm probably going to need to cut those little triangular shapes out of that curve in order to make it behave. But let's just start by pressing it right now. And I'll make the decision about clipping it later. I probably will end up clipping it. But my main focus right now is just making sure that the center back seam where I want to put the zipper is behaving. And I think I will use my hammer. So I start from the back side so that I can see that I'm pushing the seam allowance in the correct direction. And then once I get it kind of trained to do what I want, then I'll flip it over to the front side to make sure that it looks nice. So my seam is still a little bubbly. So in order to get that to lay the way I want, I probably am going to have to clip that curve. So the yoke seam allowance, which is the seam allowance here that's closest to the yoke, that's probably going to need to get clipped. So if you're having trouble getting your seam to look nice, be patient, but also know that you probably have to clip your curve. I would prefer not to clip my curve if I can beat it into submission with the iron. Because my fabric is loose weave, I would like more seam allowance to help it not unravel. And like I said, my textile is made out of a wool fiber. So let's see if we can look down into my seam allowance and see how that worked. So I don't know if you can see it now, but the seam allowance was super roughly before, and now it's laying pretty flat because wool with heat allows you to shape it a little better than some other fibers. So now that I have that pressed, I'm going to do this exact same procedure to the other side of the back skirt and back yoke. I'm going to sew those two together and then I'm going to press them. I'm going to lay this out so that you can see the shape. So my fabric, again, is loose weave, so it's a little unstable. But what you should see, hopefully, on yours is that the center back is a pretty straight line, and the side seam has more of a curve to it, and then this is the waist curve here. So let's go do the other side.